Hello, everybody. I'm sharing my screen. Let me make sure that it's well centered. There you go. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jan, for your warm introduction. I'm honored to be part of this series, which to my knowledge is the only one that focuses exclusively on interpreting studies, which we are usually sometimes a side note to the bigger translation studies. So you are my people, and I'm really honored to be here. Also speaking about a topic that's really close to my heart. I was thinking the other day when I was preparing the talk, how long have I been researching language access in prison? It's been over 15 years. And as you will see, corollary of language access in prisons is non-professional interpreting, and I've been studying that for well over a decade. So I'm very excited that you may be interested in this, and I'm excited to share what I've learned about this area in all of these many years so far. So this is a little roadmap of my presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of context about language diversity in prisons. I'm going to talk about language access policy in prisons, then practice, and then actual practice in practice. What really happens in the prisons based on actual visits to prisons, interviews with stakeholders, and recorded interviews where there was an interpreter present. So starting with the context, I need to start with a disclaimer, which is something that I don't really like to do, but we do not have numbers. We do not have data on linguistic diversity per se in prison. The closest numbers that we may have are those of foreign national prisoners, which is not an accurate measure, right? Because it does not account, obviously, for those foreign nationals who do speak the institutional language, but most importantly, does not account for national individuals who are users of other languages, who are users of sign languages, who are users of indigenous languages, or official or non-official languages of the country or the state or the region that the prison is, but those languages are minoritized to certain degrees and not used extensively within the prison as a vehicular language. So with that caveat, I'm going to talk a lot about foreign nationals in prisons. And in the particular case of Spanish prisons that I'm going to talk to about at the end, that is the case. Those are the prisoners that bring the linguistic diversity, which are the ones who are not Spanish nationals. But what we know so far is that there's about 500,000 individuals that are incarcerated in countries outside their countries of origin. And that figure has been steady almost since I started doing research in this field. For the past 10, 15 years, there's usually about 500,000 people incarcerated abroad. And this has to do, this multilingualism and this multiculturalism that happens in the prison systems has to do with migration flows. It has to do with the internationalization of crime. But also another thing that we need to take into account is that sentences sometimes tend to be more severe for foreign nationals. They have limited access to probation and parole options, so they spend more time in prison. And we know that there is a human rights commitment to the principle of non-discrimination in legislation throughout the world, national, international, and non-discrimination based on different factors, including origin. But the reality is that foreign nationals face a lot of specific challenges in prison. And what has been shown is that the language barrier is the most pervasive form of exclusion. And it creates a lack of, because of two main things. It creates a lack of understanding of their rights, the system of detention, complaint and appeal procedures, but it also limits the prisoners' access to facilities, to services, to rehabilitation and treatment programs, to opportunities in education or vocational training courses. And what's even more significant in some way is the mental health toll that it takes. And as you see in the quote on the screen, the fact that communication might be severely hampered can trigger feelings of social isolation, uncertainty, and helplessness that some researchers have been able to compare to those feelings created by solitary confinement, extended periods of solitary confinement. And I really like this quote because it summarizes very clearly what the language barrier challenge is for foreign nationals in prisons around the world, because the last paragraph shows how is this language barrier dealt with, and it talks about the goodwill of prison staff and fellow prisoners and the availability of an interpreter, assuming professional interpreters, which, as we're going to see in a few minutes, are not that common at all. If any of you are interested in the field, this volume is fabulous. It's a 2-volume book. It's called Foreigners in European Prisons. It's the most extensive resource so far, published so far, on the situation of foreign nationals in prisons at an international level. It's only focused on the EU, but it's a 2-volume book that covers each of the countries in the EU, and each country has a whole chapter devoted to it. So I wanted to conduct a study to see what language access policy and practice there is in prison systems around the world. And I actually conducted this study, and I've updated it twice by now because things keep changing. And what I chose to study were 50 prison systems in 40 different countries that at the time of the studies had met 2 very important criteria to me, which were, there were the criteria that to me were closest to signaling that the language barrier might be an issue. They had at least 10% of foreign nationals, and that number was over 100. It was funny a couple of times where I had the issue of Malta, where 100 of their prison system was, the prison population was foreign. And then I looked at the total number of prison population, there was 1. So they had 1 person incarcerated, and they happened to be non-Maltese. So in order to control for those outlier cases, those are the criteria that I set, because we do not have available data about language proficiency levels of the prison population. And then I did a qualitative analysis of prison legislation and internal prison directives, but it is all overt language policy. So I'm going to talk about what's in the law and what's in the prison law and regulations. Sometimes different countries and different regions have laws that can apply to the prison system, but they're broader for a wider range of services. I was not looking at those in particular. And again, I'm talking about overt instruments, which means that it's what it's published and written out there. There may be some informal policies that are not codified anywhere that I, as a researcher, would not have access to anyway. But before I talk about what happens in each of these prison systems, I wanted to give you an overview of what happens internationally. And there are a few international organizations that have issued rules and guidelines about how to deal with linguistic diversity within prisons. As you can see, the United Nations started talking about this, well, like in the 1950s already. It is true that the initial mentions were very succinct, but in 2015, for example, in particular, they were extended a little bit more, and we went from the 1955 providing the services of an interpreter to an independent, competent interpreter free of charge, and then not only in disciplinary procedures, but also in admission, legal counseling, procedures. But of all the international regulations out there, the most thorough one is the recommendation 2012-12 of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, which includes over a dozen of sections and subsections that talk about what kinds of information need to be made available to prisoners in an understandable manner, access to translation and interpreting, and other language provisions. That is exceptional. It's not very common. For us in the Americas right now, we can see that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights also has some provisions, but they're also very limited. But I'm going to say the problem, quote unquote, with these provisions is not necessarily that they're limited, but that they're not binding. So it is up to the discretion of the different prison system and prison authorities and legal legislative bodies, national legislative bodies, to see what actually becomes hard law. And the reality is, when you look at the national legal frameworks of these 50 prison systems, the provisions are few, if any, usually under 5, and they use very vague and qualified language. They talk about making information available in a way that the prisoner will understand. What does that mean? What would be that way? And there's a lot of qualifications and opt-outs, a lot of whenever necessary, if possible, if available, that gives, in my opinion, a way out and to the prison systems to the actual implementation of these measures. And if these few provisions, when they're available, they focused on very specific points of the term of imprisonment, which are mainly during admission, and disciplinary procedures, then they talk a lot about language learning, in which case they're putting the onus on the inmate themselves, on the inmate themselves to acquire the institutional language, to be able to communicate directly and not need any language access. And then one thing that is actually appears very often because of the nature of the institution is that translation and interpreting is often resorted to or is mandated in some cases when communications need to be monitored following a court order. So for security purposes, yes, but to make the inmate's life easier, not so often. And you can see that I'm a little skeptical and bitter sometimes in this sense. So once I saw what the policy is, I wanted to know what happens in practice. So I surveyed all these prison systems to see how they overcome the language barrier when there is one. And there are a lot of areas in which they do things. I'm going to focus exclusively on interpreting and interpreting service provision, which is the topic of our talk today. But if we have time later, and if you are interested, I can talk about translated materials in different languages, language learning, hiring staff that are multilingual, and so on. But in terms of interpreting provision, giving this legal framework that can be described as weak, it does come as no surprise that the responsibility for interpreting services in prisons all over the world falls on informal interpreters, and most often prisoners themselves. More rarely staff, and as I'm going to tell later, it's very rare that professionals are hired. And prisoners act informally as interpreters. Usually whenever needed, the person or people who need them just look for somebody who may be able to help. But there's a good example of a structured approach that I feel is worth discussing. In England and Wales, they have this program called the Foreign National Prisoner Orderlies, which is a program whereby there's a training for prisoners who want to work in this role. They select them, they train them, so that they can act as helpers or contribute to the integration of newly arrived prisoners. They are the main link with staff and these foreign prisoners. They circulate information, and they also keep running lists of other prisoners who have language skills that can be called in to interpret. Orderlies themselves do not need to have language skills to be able to interpret, but most of them do. And they receive a payment, just like in any other job in the prison. And sometimes those who interpret also received a little bit of money for their work. In terms of staff, the availability is more limited for two reasons. Sometimes the language combinations just do not match what the prison population needs. And on the other hand, the staff have responsibilities that they would need to leave aside to jump in and interpret for their colleagues. So staff availability to help us informal interpreters is much more limited. But there are few prison systems that also have some structured ways in which they're trying to facilitate this, other than just running around and trying to look for someone that may help. For example, the Canadian federal prison system created a while ago, many years ago actually by now, a directory of staff who speak a foreign language in its institution that their colleagues could resort to. In New South Wales, in Australia, there's this staff that speak other languages are accredited by an external government agency so that they can prove their language skills, and then they are the ones that go into this on-call list, so to speak. And for example, the California Department of Corrections adheres to a statewide bilingual pay differential program whereby people who test in a language and use that language in their job functions for a certain percentage of the time receive a monthly kind of bonus in their salaries. Professionals are the least often used. The use of professionals in prisons tends to be exceptional. It tends to be limited to high stakes situation. It's seen more like as a complementary measure to the informal interpreters, and not in all those prison systems that I surveyed. In some cases, it is mandated by law that certain interactions are certain interactions are mediated by a professional interpreter, for example, medical consultations in certain jurisdictions. And obviously, professionals are hired when they're not paid by the prison system itself. For example, attorney-client visits that the attorney brings the interpreter with them, and it's paid for by the prisoner or their family or whatnot. And one thing that's been interesting to see over the past 15 years is that the participation of professionals in interpreting services in prisons has grown increasingly remote in all other areas of our lives, but in prisons, it also solves a bunch of other issues, such as background checks that are required to go into the prison, and security clearances, that doing it remotely facilitates the process in that way, facilitates the bureaucracy of it. But what my informants in these surveys were mentioning is that they had some serious concerns about using prisoners as interpreters. The power structure can be completely altered because they believe that the prisoner interpreters conferred massive power over the other prisoner and also over the staff member, that their influence can affect the interpersonal relationships between the staff and the foreign language speaker. They can influence the reactions of the foreign language speaker. They can have an impact on the trust building process between staff and prisoner. They have concerns about potential breach of confidentiality, and obviously they have concerns about the quality of the interpretation itself by these people who have not been trained and whose even language competence has not necessarily been tested. So I wanted to know what happens about this practice in actual practice. I do not have a photo of me walking into a prison, so I found this one with this guy walking into a prison. Just imagine that's me. So I went in this first study 4 prisons in Spain, in one particular region in Spain where I got permission to conduct my study. And I did surveys with foreign language speaking inmates, with inmates that act as interpreters, and interviews with prison staff and management. And among many other things that I talked to them about, we talked about what their communication strategies are. How do they talk to these prisoners who do not speak Spanish? And there's a clear preference for using Spanish at a basic level, supported by any kind of gestures, trying, as the quote says on the side, and all these quotes are my translations from the Spanish originals, that I gathered in the interviews. I try in any way I can. Even with gestures, I prefer to communicate directly. And then the use of an interpreter, which in the case of Spanish prisons is another prisoner, is an alternative option when this basic Spanish with gestures, is not working. And the main reasons why they try to avoid other prisoners acting as interpreters are the potential lack of skills. They talk about difficulty knowing how well they would be able to deal, for example, with legal terminology, privacy issues. They feel like the foreign language speaking prisoner may not open up as much if they are talking through one of their peers. And most importantly, this kept coming over and over again, mistrust. And I think that this quote is very illustrative, and I'm gonna read it quickly. It says, besides, if the person translating is translating what he wants and how he wants, because maybe he's trying to get something from you, well, then I don't know. On the flip side, some people report that they assume that the interpreter will behave as best as they can, right? They trust that the interpreter would have the foreign language speaking prisoner's best interest at heart. If he's his friend, he will help him. And another thing that did drive the use of prisoners as interpreter is availability, especially if some of these informants had worked in other spaces or in organizations other than prisons. Because this in particular is what a prison doctor saying, I'm better off here than in a clinic, because here, and he actually, after this quote, he said, I can go out of the yard and shout out, and I'm quoting him, Mohammed, come over here, we have a new guy from Morocco and I need your help. And he has that availability if he were working in a clinic. And this is framed into a context in which in Spain, for example, medical interpreting is not as ubiquitous as it may be in other places. So if the patient doesn't bring an interpreter with them, there may not be an interpreter to mediate there. And there is a very common in-between position of resignation. We do what we can. We use prisoners when we can because we do not have any other option. Communication could be better, but we're doing the best we can with the resources we have. But in general, I could see a lot of a negative opinion. But then when I asked them how in abstract, in theory, but then when I asked them, well, how happy are you when in the interactions you've had so far with prisoners acting as interpreters? And almost 40% of staff said they're happy or very happy. It is true that another 40% said very unhappy or unhappy, but I was expecting those numbers to be different, to be a lot less satisfaction. I do understand that prisoners could have more satisfaction. And that is the case with interpreting service users throughout the research, that the non-institutional language speaking user tends to be happier with the service provision in general. But these numbers surprised me, because then I was wondering, well, despite having all these negative thoughts and negative opinions, why are they satisfied? They don't know what they're talking about. Like they don't know how to assess that. I didn't think that that was fair, to think that there's a trope that comes up in interpreting studies that I've seen cited in a bunch of studies to say, well, clients don't know what's good for them. That could be true, but that, I feel, infantilizes a little bit, infantilizes interpreter users. Maybe there are other things that we're not having into account. We're assessing these interpretations in terms of accuracy. We look at accuracy and terminology and correct language use and the neutrality of the role. And maybe there are other things that matter to staff and prisoners that we, as interpreters, as interpreting scholars and professors, do not know, that play a role in increasing that satisfaction. Or is it possible, bear with me with this hypothesis, that these interpretations are not that bad? So I went in another prison again, actually 2 other prisons, and I can give you more details on the method, but I witnessed and recorded interpreted interviews mediated by another prisoner. And then I got people to evaluate the quality of this interpretation. And the people that I got to assess it were the inmate involved, the non-Spanish speaking inmate, the staff member, and then 2 external experts. One that had a kind of a more interpreting instructor, teacher, professor profile, and one that was a professional interpreter. That was their main professional capacity. And as you can see, and these are the interviews, and these are all mental health related interviews, because those were the informants that were willing to participate, the therapists and counselors in those prisons that I visited. And we have a range of evaluations. We have that inmates tend to be more generous with their assessments than the staff, and then the experts, which was to expect. But there are some interpretations that are rated really positively by some of the experts, but the 2 of them, or at least one, and that overall, the green ones, got really good in general assessment. Most of them are and then there are a few that are in the red. And what does a good assessment look like? And this is what one of the experts said about one of the interviews that was highlighted in green. They talk about global correctness and similitude, what could be considered a professional interpretation. And the focus is mostly on the fact that the interpreter does not intervene, does not get personally involved in the conversation, does not introduce his own opinions, does not get involved, does not express his own value judgments. And then also they mentioned that the interpreter has good language use. But if you go back to this is ML19, the staff member and the inmate were not particularly impressed, which is food for thought. And I'm not gonna leave it there. I'm gonna pick that back up in a minute. But then what was a little bit more telling was, what was the trigger for the negative evaluations? And the experts mostly were concerned about the interpreter overstepping its role. They answer questions directed to the prisoner, gives his own opinions, acts as the prisoner advocate. It's an awful interpretation. Staff and prisoners don't seem to care about that. They talk about the 2 interviews rated most negatively, actually. the only two that were rated really negatively by either the prisoner here or the staff member here had to do with the relationship between the participants and the dynamics of the interaction. The staff member that said this interpretation, I'll just throw it in the trash, he was triggered by the fact that the non-Spanish speaking prisoner was a very powerful prisoner and had basically dictated how the interpreter had to act. And he mentioned to me later, the interpreter had memorized his script. So he did not believe anything that transpired in that interaction. The prisoner that rated an interpretation as completely useless was one that identified an ethnic conflict between his ethnicity and the ethnicity of the prisoner that was interpreting for him. And he ended up saying, I do not believe anything that he told me. And I would like to have another interview with this counselor to follow up on the information that he gave me, because I cannot trust this interpreter. And the experts do also mention that there are accuracy mistakes that distort a little bit of meaning of the loss. They lose a little bit of nuances. There's lack of knowledge of terms or poor grammar. But again, the biggest concern was these interpreters are overstepping the role. And then I decided to dig deeper, because I was like, but how is it possible that the parties are all okay with this? Like, we as experts, as people who know about interpreting, have learned for decades that this is not how an interpreter behaves. How are you guys okay with this? So I'm going to look into what really happens. And then I started listening to the audio recordings of the interviews and analyzing the transcripts, which I hadn't done so far. I had left the experts do. And what I found out is that we are overlooking the power of the primary participants in an interaction. That is something that I feel like has been happening in interpreting studies for a while, and it's starting to shift. But primary participants have a huge role to play in making communication successful, especially when we're dealing with non-professionals, because they can help guide behaviors, they can help support the limitations of the non-professionals. And I'm going to give you, in the interest of time, like 3 quick examples. We have here an interview between a therapist and a foreign language speaking, a non-Spanish speaking inmate, mediated by another inmate. And the therapist asks, does he have kids? And the interpreter replies, he doesn't convey the question, he directly says no. And he explains why he's intervening. I answer because he's been with me for a year in the cell. The therapist is very aware that this prisoner, this interpreter, is not conveying the message. He's answering on behalf of his peer. But she's okay with this. She's like, claro, muy bien, sure, well. And she follows up, kind of acknowledging further and trying to look for the source of that knowledge, right? Or confirm the source of that knowledge. Are you cellmates? The interpreter answers, yes, he's my cellie, he's a good guy. Therapist is totally cool with that. That is a very open and clear for everybody. I am the interpreter, not acting as an interpreter. She's like, muy bien, very well. And then she reconducts the interaction to focus on the non-Spanish speaking prisoner again and return the interpreter to an interpreter role. She turns her gaze, you cannot see it here, but it's on my field notes. She turns her gaze, looks at the non-Spanish speaking prisoner, and she's like, are you a Muslim? And then the interpreter jumps back into his interpreting role, translating by, are you Muslim? And the interpreter and the non-Spanish speaking prisoner replies, yes. The counselor approves openly of this overstep of the role. And it is true that the counselor, the therapist, has the institutional power to do so. she is looking out for a certain goal in communication. For her, in this moment, my hypothesis is it is not as important for me to know whether he has kids or not. This is at the beginning of the interview when she's trying just to break the ice. She's more interested in learning what the dynamics between the inmates are, the fact that he gets along well with his cellmate may have implications for his mental health. So this for her, I'm assuming it's valuable information, even though the interpreter is overstepping his role. This is not always the case. The therapist in this situation knows exactly what's happening. Let me give you the context. There's an inmate, a French-speaking inmate, who has been moved from one residential wing to another because, as it states in the case file, he had a problem with another prisoner in that previous residential wing. So he's moved to the residential unit, and this is the first time he meets with the therapist that is responsible for the prisoners in the residential unit. In Spain, I forgot to mention, the workload for the therapists in the prison is you're assigned 1 or 2 residential units, and those are your clients, and you take care of them. So you do not necessarily, as a therapist, ever have contact with an inmate in a residential unit you've not been assigned to. So when he moves, he has this first contact interview with the therapist so that they get familiar with each other. And one of her questions is, and what have you been doing since you've been here? And the interpreter starts translating. She's asking what you've been doing since you've been here. And then he switches to answer to her directly. And he explains to her, the fact is, the thing is that this gentleman can't get out of here because he had this problem. This is I'm explaining to you. He had this problem with another inmate. He can't leave the residential unit. He cannot go to common areas. He cannot do any vocational training, any educational training that takes place in a shared area of the prison. He just can't leave. The therapist knows that. Her goal is not to gather objective information. Her job is probably here. Her goal is to prompt the non-Spanish speaking prisoner to talk a little bit about his situation. So she's like, yeah, I know. Let him explain it. So she is asserting here her institutional authority and saying, I don't like this. I don't like that you're answering for your peer right here, for whatever reason. So she corrects the intervention and restores the triadic conversation. And in the next lines, which I did not reproduce here, you would see that the interpreter becomes an interpreter again. And you would think, yeah, of course, the therapist can do this. She has the institutional power. But what happens with the poor non-Spanish speaking prisoner? He doesn't have that power. It is true they don't have that power, but they have another power that the therapist doesn't have, which is they usually understand a little bit of Spanish, enough to monitor what the interpreter is saying. Usually that's not the case the other way around. The therapist may have the institutional power, but she is usually very unaware of what's happening in the other language. The prisoner, unless it's someone who has just arrived to the prison and was extradited, and was not living in Spain before getting arrested and imprisoned, they would know some Spanish. The interaction is a little bit transparent to them. So here you have an example in which it is the prisoner who sets a boundary for the interpreter. They're talking about drug use, the history of drug use of the English-speaking prisoner in this case. And it's stated that he started doing drugs at around the age of 15, and the therapist wants to know what drugs he started having. The interpreter renders that question. What did you first have? He prompts the answer because he knows the inmate. He's like, weed, huh? The prisoner confirms, weed, hashish. And then the interpreter gives an expanded rendition. He says he started with hashish, then amphetamines, and there's an overlap here. The prisoner who's following and hears amphetamine, he says pills. Yes, had pills. The interpreter adds ecstasy, and then he adds and cocaine. The prisoner says, wait a minute. Not until I was 23, I had coca. So the prisoner, even though he doesn't have the institutional authority, and it may be a little face threatening to say, no, this is not true, and correct his peer who's helping him out of the goodness of his heart. He's like, no, I don't want this therapist to think that I was doing coke when I was 15. This is important to me. So in a nutshell, because it's 11:45 already, what I found is that primary participants have a ton of agency that can help support and guide the behaviors of interpreting in any context, but most importantly, of interpreting by non-professionals who are the ones that have never been subject to any standards of behavior, that may not have the language skills, that need more support and more guidance, and they're only learning by trial and error. So that's where the primary participants can make a big difference in creating the interpretation that works for everybody. And they are prompted by overt clues, an answer on behalf of the prisoner, an utterance that is super long, as opposed to a very short answer by the prisoner, a side conversation, things that are very obvious that the interpreter is intervening, but also covert issues based, for example, on their knowledge of the case, the knowledge of the institution. The therapist knows that the interpreter is providing information for the prisoner that comes from his knowledge of him not being able to move residential wings, for example, right? So me as a therapist, I know the case file. Or, for example, the case of does he have kids? It may be in his file that he doesn't have kids. I do not really know. I do not really mind if that information is not conveyed totally accurately, because I have other ways, or I have, if the interpreter had answered and said, yes, but I know that in my record, it says he doesn't have kids, that's a covert clue that I can use for challenging that interpreter response. Then the collaboration between all the parties is multi-level. It works at the linguistic. I've only shown you role transgressions, right? Because that's what concerned the most. That was the most concerning to the people that were part of my study. But they, the primary participants support the non-professional interpreters in their language performance, in using certain terms, in explaining certain things. They help them to translate more accurately, to clarify their questions. And there's an like a dance almost, in which everybody's helping each other, or everybody is setting boundaries for each other. These instances are priority-based. These instances of collaboration and negotiation are priority-based. As I was saying, I may not care to know really if he has kids or not, but I do care that he explains to me that he cannot leave this residential wing. And my priorities may shift during my interaction. And they're highly context dependent. In the situation, in the case of prisons in particular, where there is an intrinsic antagonistic component to the relationship between prisoners and staff, but a necessary collaborative need or a collaborative need for the therapeutic relationship to work, I'm going to be balancing those two things. I'm going to maybe trying to make everybody comfortable, the interpersonal relationships work better. And I'm trying to overcome this inherent tensions because I need that to provide mental health services. So to wrap up, my final thoughts are, as we've seen, the language policy for access, or the policies for language access in prisons throughout the world, both at the international level, which is non-binding, and especially at the national level, is pretty minimal. And then it comes as no surprise that the practice is based on non-professional interpreters, mostly prisoners, which in the abstract generates a lot of trepidation, but then in reality, there's a certain degree of satisfaction of the parties involved about how well these interpreters actually meet their needs. And then if we check the quality of those interpretations, some of them end up showing that they are objectively pretty decent. But what's most importantly is that there is an interactional system of checks and balances in which the primary participants exert a lot of agency to make sure that the conversation actually works for everybody and that it meets their conversational and possibly their interpersonal goals. And that is all. I'm going to leave that there for a second. That's the reference for the Foreign Eastern European Prisons book and a few of the articles in which I expand a little bit on all that I've talked to you about today. And this is my big thank you, everybody, for your attention today.